Thank you all so much for joining us. We're delighted to have Emily with us for this book talk and really excited to have you all here to kick off this new series. As Julia mentioned, the China Connection series is a new initiative we're starting at the U.S.-China Education Trust. We'll be here based at GW on a monthly basis, featuring all sorts of experts on China, from those, bringing the deep expertise and resources we have here in Washington to bear in our community and really helping to shed light on the top issues in U.S.-China relations, experts who've spent their careers trying to understand China and transferring that knowledge into the community to try to deepen our understanding of China here in Washington. And so with that, we could not be more glad to welcome Emily, who really embodies this ethos in her reporting and her work on China, and is someone I'm very glad to call a dear friend. We met in Beijing a while ago now, and I personally always looked at Emily's reporting as not only fact-based and detailed and nuanced, as we come to expect from our NPR reporters, but really empathetic in a way that I think is really hard to find sometimes in reporting on China. So I'm looking forward to a conversation with her, and I'll read through her impressive bio here quickly, but first want to clear some housekeeping out of the way before we get started. I'll remind everyone in the audience that this event is on the record and will be photographed and recorded, so letting you know that now. We'll have a discussion here. We're starting a little bit late, but we'll end, I think, try to end close to 5. I know some folks need to get on the road at that time. But we will preserve quite a lot of time for Q&A, and looking into the audience, I see some distinguished China experts here who I'm sure will have some really good contributions to add to the conversation. So we'll open up to the floor quite early. And I also want to note that in the spirit of our new event, China Connections, we're excited to not only welcome you all to this event, but to celebrate this with a drink on us at Chang Chang, the Chinese restaurant in DuPont Circle, which has wonderful Chinese food and also features a lot of Chinese food, but also expertise on China through its programming as well. So by joining today, you've been entered into a lucky draw, and we will, at the end of today's event, draw a voucher for one participant who showed up today to get a voucher on us to enjoy a bite or a drink there to celebrate our new series with us. And we're really happy to have you here. So, sorry, and one last plug is that our next China Connection series will be in May, and we'll be featuring a panel on AAPI perspectives on foreign policy, featuring AAPI female experts who contribute to the China field, either through policy roles or through analysis at think tanks, and we'll be partnering with the Women's Foreign Policy Group for that discussion. So we'll have some more information about that shortly. So if you're not signed up for our email newsletters yet, you should feel free to get on our list, and you'll get information about our next event. So with that, I will kick off our conversation with Emily. We're delighted to have her here. Emily has served as NPR's international correspondent and reported from both Beijing and Taipei. Her reporting has taken her all over China, and you've, I'm sure, likely heard her voice on the radio, covering breaking news, current events topics, and kind of more deeply reported and humanistic stories from East Asia over her years of reporting. Prior to joining NPR in 2019, she served as a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times. And we're here to talk about her wonderful new book, which she has brought copies of today and can sign after. And this book is a really, I think, interesting, mix of stories from your reporting and from your time spent in China, Taiwan, and back here. And we're really looking forward to the conversation to dive into these topics today. And to kick off the conversation in the spirit of China Connections, I wanted to ask about your connection to China. How did you get into this field, and how do you consider your connection to China?
First of all, thank you for having me. And I apologize for being late. That is my fault. Sorry to keep everyone waiting. I got into China because I knew that I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I just kind of ended up in China. You hear me now? So I knew that I wanted to be a foreign correspondent, and I loved reporting in China, but China was not my first choice. I wanted to report in Myanmar. Around the time that I was looking at jobs, this was 2015, and so things were still optimistic in Myanmar. It was, I think, maybe year 3 of Aung San Suu Kyi as president. There were already signs that press freedoms were cracking a bit there, but I did go to Burma for a couple of weeks and decided this is super interesting, but this is probably not the best place as a freelance journalist just starting out to dive into. It was really expensive, bizarrely, and also people were getting fired already for reporting on the Rohingya crisis. And I just knew that as a freelance journalist just starting out, that it was maybe not the most stable place to go. But then I thought to myself, I speak Mandarin Chinese. I've been learning to read the language finally in university. I studied Spanish, but had some time to do some Mandarin. And just went to China, admittedly on a tourist visa. This was 2015 when things were just starting to close a little bit. And I arrived July 2015, which looking back now was the week after the 705 lawyers crackdown. So this is when about almost 400 human rights lawyers around the country were rounded up and detained. And it was kind of the beginning of what we know now as Xi Jinping's China. I didn't know this when I arrived. I was full of optimism and energy. But the story of the China that I reported was very much that China, of that closing of space for political expression and civil organizing.
So, well, we're delighted that you picked China. I think we benefit from your reporting.
It's been really, really fun.
Yeah.
There's been ups and downs.
What do you think has kept you in the field? As an international correspondent, I assume you could have gone to other beats and other countries. What is it about China that has kind of kept you connected?
It is so big and so diverse. And what is China has always been changing. That's what I wanted to get at in the book. Literally the boundaries of China, the Chinese empire, the tensions between the current nation state and what they've inherited from the Qing Empire are still very much at play. It's a big country with great public infrastructure. So unlike, I think, international correspondents who then go to the continent of Africa or who get assigned to India or even who have the privilege of doing Southeast Asia, where sometimes just getting to a place can take days. In China, the benefit is if something happens excluding Tibet, you can basically get there within 6 or 7 hours, and it's relatively safe for a female reporter to work on her own. So the conditions are there for an amazingly diverse set of topics and places that you can go. And then because I spoke the language, it was really, really easy to get around. There were obviously downsides, and those mounted in the years that I was there in China. So we saw the rise of digital surveillance really become pervasive and common. And that became the biggest hindrance, in addition to the COVID protocols starting in 2022. As in the COVID protocols got much stricter that year. That started clamping down on the kinds of stories we could do. Is that better?
Is that better?
Speak up.
Okay.
So you kind of alluded to can everyone hear okay? Okay. You alluded to the challenges of reporting in China. Your book starts with a really, I think, compelling vision of you really coming, into confrontation with the fact that you might not be able to report in China to the degree that you want, or the time frame that you want. It might get cut short due to the authorities or pressures or to something else. Can you, maybe for those who haven't read the book, kind of bring us into the headspace that you were in when you decided to write this book?
Sure. Apologies if the audio is really low. Ironically, for a radio journalist, I have a very weak voice. So thank you for the very kind introduction, Julia. I hope that I'm not known first and foremost as a journalist who's banned from going to China. But I mean, I started conceptualizing this book because I had this inclination that this was the direction that China was headed towards, particularly with regards to foreign journalists in China. And I begin the book with a scene from late 2019, sitting in the Beijing Capital Airport, being held up for the upteenth time at customs and immigration, and being asked again over and over about my work. And this had been increasingly common as the Hong Kong protests were taking off, and I was flying all the time to Hong Kong, from Beijing to Hong Kong. And I just thought one of these nights, like, I was definitely going to be deported. And if not that night, then maybe another. And so I started thinking about ways that I could report on China outside of China and how to keep my connection to this country, which I'd grown to really care about and had invested a lot of time in trying to understand if I couldn't physically be there one day as a journalist.
So what did that look like?
Well, I got a few more years in China. I left in April 2022 for a vacation and I wasn't able to go back and I moved to Taiwan, which was also really lovely. And most of the book was actually written in Taiwan, which shaped the form of the book a little bit. But the story of China is global. And I think that's from both a reporting perspective. There are the economic, cultural, political influence of China is not just contained within its boundaries. It's a regional story. I think it's a global story. But also it becomes much more interesting, I think, when you start to connect the dots between what happens in Beijing and how that affects someone standing in Texas and vice versa, or someone in Indonesia who's looking at Belt and road investments from China and so on and so forth. And that's been one of my focuses in the years that I've left China, and also thinking about identity, which is such a central theme in this book, that identity and production of cultural products in the Mandarin language or media that's about China, both from a pop culture perspective, but also in terms of journalism and academia, doesn't have to be centered in the PRC itself, or even in the traditionally Mandarin-speaking world that we think of in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, but that it's increasingly happening around the world, in North America and Europe and Southeast Asia, where there are Chinese diaspora populations or people who have just simply spent a lot of time engaging with that culture. And so the end of the book, the book begins in kind of the economic heartland of mainland China, the East Coast, but it gradually takes us out to the historical borderlands of the Qing Empire, finally to Taiwan, and then it ends with the diaspora in the US, and that was intentional because I think that some of the most exciting reporting and cultural production in the Chinese world is actually happening outside of China these days.
Yeah, I love that in your book that the stories really do transcend geography, that it's activists from Hong Kong who end up in Taiwan, dissidents from China who we've crossed paths with back in the US. And it really captures the global scope of these communities that are increasingly moving outside of the boundaries of China. In some ways mirroring your own path.
And what would be ideal is we could connect the two, right?
Yeah.
I would love to go back to China. I have tried. I'm optimistic that it'll happen again at some point as a journalist. But it would be amazing if we could both connect what's happening here, what's happening in China, and that reporting and those perspectives. Obviously, it's becoming increasingly difficult, and we have fewer journalists who are getting visas to live and work in China. But that would be ideal. Without being the ability to live and work in China, I think that this is the best that we can do, and it's interesting on its own merits.
So you referenced the low number of journalists in China. Something at USCET we're focusing quite a lot on is the low number of American students studying in China as well. And these are just two kind of examples, but across the board, ordinary business travel and personal travel and all sorts of engagements between Americans and China is decreasing, especially post-pandemic. How do you report mostly for an American audience, but how do you capture the nuances of China? How do you bring the stories of China to an American audience, either in this book or in your journalistic, your radio reporting?
I think audio is great for that because you can hear directly from the people who are living through the stories that you're reporting on. Audio also justifies stories that I think sometimes don't really work for print, but just because they sound interesting or quirky or beautiful, it justifies 3 or 4 minutes on the radio. So I've gotten stories about people that I don't think would have made the news if I worked for only a newspaper, but just worked for NPR. The book was definitely a project in empathy. It was a project in empathy. I think that I hope China watchers learn something if they read the book, but mostly I hope that people who don't follow China, don't monitor news about China, can still pick up the book and go, these are people whose stories are interesting on their own, not because they're news, not because they affect geopolitics or the US-China relationship anyway, though I think that they do, but simply because they're humans and they've lived through really, really interesting times and they're incredibly resilient.
What do you think American audiences need to understand about China? Whether it's kind of the misconceptions you're working against in your reporting or, just the kind of the dominant narratives that you think are kind of currently in the world that you're operating against. Yeah, exactly.
This is obvious, I think, for anyone who's written or lived in China, but China is just not a monolith. And this is about identity, and it's about highlighting the organic diversity of identity in China. And I interpret identity broadly. So there's the usual, there's a chapter about someone who is confronting ideas of gender as they relate to reproduction in China. There are stories of ethnic minorities who have come under increasing controls and surveillance in China, in Xinjiang. I highlight language policy, religious tolerance, but also, identity is also, I think, political values, different visions for how China should develop economically as a society, as a country, in this book. And these questions, there have been so many different ideas in play about what is China, how it should evolve over the millennia. And I wanted to capture that in the book. So, I mean, to ground it maybe more in concrete things that we're talking about here in Washington, D.C., when policymakers are talking about the threat from China or potential espionage from Chinese students and greater controls and academic exchanges and things like that, that is treating a category of people in a country as monolith, which is just not what happens. And it's honestly not productive or effective in any way. And I hope there's no policy prescriptions in this book. This is not meant to be a wonky book, but I hope if people read this, they realize there's a lot of things and a lot of people who have come from very different backgrounds, who all consider themselves Chinese, who come from the PRC and elsewhere, who are in discussion about what it means to be Chinese.
That theme of identity is in the through line that links all of these stories in the book, and the characters really come from all walks of life, but I think you frame and really draw out the ways in which they are navigating the relationship with the state and navigating the relationship with Chineseness. Are there any highlights that you want to share of individuals who come to mind who you think kind of embody that tension within Chinese society today of navigating identity?
I'll talk about two characters. So there is one character named Yusuf, who his story gives the book its title, Let Only Red Flowers Bloom, which is a riff off of Let 100 Flowers Bloom, Let 100 Thoughts of Schools with Thought Content. And he is someone who considers himself a Chinese patriot, considers himself Chinese. He also happens to have been born to Hui Muslim parents. And in the book, I describe this religious epiphany that he has as a teenager and the journey that takes him on as a Muslim intellectual and publisher, but also as a Chinese person trying to figure out how he fits into Chinese society. And he makes it his intellectual mission to prove, to some controversy, that Islam is uniquely Chinese, that it's been adapted in the Chinese context, that many of the precepts of Islam actually come from Confucianism and Taoism, which doesn't make him very popular among his fellow Muslims. I'm not saying I agree with him, but he's trying to thread the needle between being both Chinese and a devout Muslim, and he doesn't see any contradiction between the two. He, needless to say, does not succeed. He now lives outside of China, but I found his intellectual quest really interesting. I mean, for him, it was a highly academic, theoretical debate, but when it came down to what he actually had to live through and go through, I think it illustrated well in a very visceral way for him towards the end how these identities which should not have been in conflict with another definitely came into conflict with one another. And then a second character who maybe is an unorthodox interpretation of identity is someone named Zhou Liqi, who is famous within China for being a scooter thief. And he finds himself a viral internet star for essentially becoming the unwilling poster boy for slacker culture, the lying flat movement that has become mainstream in China over the last couple of years. And unfortunately also comes into conflict with ideas of cyber sovereignty and censorship in China and what a Chinese approach to cybersecurity regulation should be. Long story short, he finds himself censored and tries to conform to this idea of, being positive energy and promoting a healthy Chinese internet, but isn't given a chance to redeem himself, if we want to use that language. So that was a really fun story to report. He did threaten to sue me. I wonder if he'll sue me after this book. Well, anyways, but that's also part of the story. So yeah, I mean, I tried to find sometimes fun, maybe unexpected ways into this theme of identity. But my point is that I think these concerns about having a uniquely Chinese approach and defining what it means to be Chinese in increasingly narrow terms undergirds everything from national security policies to things like cyber sovereignty discussions, things that we actually might care about in the news. But I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't so dry for the book.
Wonderful. Well, I mean, I enjoyed reading. I think you highlighted a real range of individuals and ways of living in China, which was such a delight to read. And I wanted to bring in an audience question that was submitted in advance of the discussion from Mike Smith, who asked, how did you find these characters? And I think I would love to hear both how you found them, but also if there were any concerns about reporting on these characters while some of them I think are still in China.
That is one of the most common questions I get, but it's a good question. How does the sausage get made? Some of these characters were people who I had interviewed for NPR stories. So there are about a third of the characters have been in news stories that I've done. But I found them so interesting, or the events that unfolded after the story so interesting, that I kept in touch with them. And I found, as I kept in touch with them and followed them over the years, that their storylines started to overlap with one another. So people who I interviewed in mainland China ended up following the events in Hong Kong in 2019, 2020, or people that I met in Hong Kong ended up meeting people who were part of the book who I met in Taiwan. So that also created more narrative heft to some of the chapters. Other people I read about in Chinese media and also found really interesting. And the great thing about being a journalist is there's no shame if you're a journalist and blindly reaching out to someone. The worst that could happen is they just don't respond to you. But I don't have any embarrassment in cold calling people or just messaging them. So the woman in the first chapter, the prosecutor, was just someone who I had read about and found profiles of her really, really interesting in Chinese media. And I knew about her because of another story I'd been reporting about, Su Zhiyong, and a human rights lawyer. And that ended up just being like a 700-word news story on NPR. But the circumstances around his arrest were so interesting. He was arrested in her home that I reached out to her and we just started talking over the phone for a couple of months. Other people, I don't know, I get all the time, how do you find sources? How do you find people? I just think everyone is kind of interesting. And I am on all platforms at all times messaging strangers, and sometimes they respond and sometimes they end up being a character in a book.
So a plug to respond to Emily's messages if she reads this out and you can end up in the book yourself. I'll just ask one more question of my own before opening it up to audience Q&A. So, you know, the US China Education Trust, we're thinking a lot about students. I know there's some students in the audience here, some from GW and some from other campuses around DC. A lot of younger folks who are interested in China, I think, are facing a lot of questions and challenges about how to enter the field today. You know, you entered the China field at a different point and you saw some transformations happening, you know, firsthand while you were living there. But what advice would you give to rising experts in the field? Would you encourage them to go to China? How do you encourage them to gain a deep and robust understanding of China, given all the constraints we are facing?
Definitely go to China, definitely go there to study the language. I think that that's still quite accessible for American students. It's just there's been a lack of interest for whatever reason. And China has shown that it really wants tourism, students, businessmen to come back and to study and work there. So I think starting out, I mean, using language study is an amazing way to get to China and will lay such a great foundation for understanding the country. I wish I were still there. I think that it would make my stories better and our understanding of China more rich. I miss the context that just living and getting a sense of the rhythm and texture of life in China lent to my reporting. But I think that China is a global story. And I think that some of the most interesting scholarship and reporting about China has been happening by connecting the dots with events regionally. And so I think anyone who is designing research questions or an academic career around interdisciplinary or regional studies still has a bright future, even when China is a part of that and is always a risk, whether or not you get denied access.
Well, great. I think I think that's a really encouraging note, especially for, I think, some of the folks in this audience who are considering how to manage the, you know, complexities of the field of a future in the China field today. So that's really appreciate your answer to that question. And I want to open it up to the audience. And I see we have some hands already. Maybe we can start in the back and come to the front. We're gonna circulate a mic and just given the acoustics in this room, maybe also try to, you know, raise your voice so we can hear you up here, but I can let you know if we can't hear you.
Thank you so much. Is this working?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm from the old generation. I have no idea.
And please introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I'm Ruth Kurtzbauer. I had the pleasure of working as a U.S. diplomat in China many times. And my question relates to one of my earlier periods when I was the junior press officer in Old Embassy, Beijing. And the question relates to whether you found variation in your access and your ability to tell your stories region to region. So when I was in Beijing, it was much more formal. I don't, in retrospect, it was good old days. But when I went to Manchuria, as Professor Emily will tell you, similar period, not long after Tiananmen, but there was an eagerness to learn about the world and be connected with the world. So we had access that seems to be unbelievable now in today's world. So I was wondering if you found any regional variations in the way you could approach people or tell your story or be under the eye or not under the eye of the authorities. Thank you so much.
For sure. I think that people in Beijing, the everyday person on the street in Beijing felt more constrained to speak. And I felt, I'm generalizing terribly here, but when you left the capital, people were much more relaxed and open to foreign journalists. It also was story specific. So if something had happened and then public security authorities were on alert about local and foreign journalists coming in reporting about the story, then for several weeks, all of a sudden you would sense a tightening. And they would be prepared to intercept foreign journalists who are trying to travel in to cover the story. There were also provinces that historically are unused to foreign media and how to deal with foreign media. And the risk there was that they would just be much more thuggish in dealing with both Chinese and international reporters. So, I mean, not just me, but many Chinese reporters have had issues going to places like Inner Mongolia, Uyghur province, Guangxi province, places where they're not used to getting a lot of outside guests, both internally within China and foreign visitors. And so their statistically, their response might be a little bit more rough without realizing that by, literally pushing around journalists or trying to destroy their equipment, that makes journalists very upset. And that's not good publicity, no matter what the story is. And invariably, to the foreign ministry's credit in Beijing, if that happened, I would always tell the foreign ministry, and they would try to reach out to local authorities and explain to them, this is not how you deal with journalists, this inevitably backfires. They had less and less success as the years went on. Local governments cared less and less about how they were perceived. But yes, there was huge regional variation, but it often was story specific. One of the challenges was trying to figure out what stories were going to elicit the local public security response that would shut down the story or prevent us from talking to people safely. And that changed over the years. I think the generation, previous to 2015, a lot of people found reporting on things like land seizures or environmental pollution cases and lawsuits sometimes sensitive to report on, demolitions for sure. But that ended up becoming much less sensitive when I was there. And instead it was stories about, ethnic minority groups, anything about Xi Jinping. Every so often, especially in like 2017, 18, 19, when sanctions on North Korea were in the news, it all of a sudden became very sensitive to do reporting on the Chinese cities along the North Korean border, which hadn't been the case in years past. And then when that story passed, scrutiny there also dissipated. So sometimes it was really story specific.
We'll come to the front and then in the middle there. Oh, middle then front. It's okay here.
Oh, another thing that was really sensitive, anything about financial collapse. Anything about a bank run, about financial product that hadn't been paid out, that was extremely sensitive.
Yeah, maybe just speak up. I
Okay.
can hear you. I can repeat it back for you.
My name's Harry Stevens. I'm a researcher, analyst. I'm an incoming master's student. There's a lot of talk, or at least in the past couple of years, there's been a great deal of discussion about about the purported dissatisfaction of Chinese youth with kind of the economic system like you mentioned, like the lie flat movement. And I'm always, as someone who is part of, a generation that is Gen Z, is the subject of frequent kind of speculation as to what, Gen Z hates work, Gen Z does this, Gen Z does that. I kind of apply some of that same suspicion to, and understanding, like you said, that things aren't monolithic to the Chinese counterparts of a similar age. But based off your kind of experience talking to people and, observing the energy and such, what can you tell us without be speaking kind of too generally about whether Chinese youth are kind of optimistic about the economy, or maybe more importantly, kind of their trust in kind of whether the economic model that kind of sustained their parents and helped their parents will prove helpful to them.
It's a very well stated question that I'm going to summarize very crudely for those in the back if you couldn't hear, but a question about Gen Z and youth attitudes in China and whether they're feeling disenfranchised with this the system that benefited their parents, or if they're and in reference to conversations like the lie flat movement and a lot of reporting that is showing that this generation is not as engaged with the system as their previous.
There is something to China is a richer country than it was 20, 30 years ago. So the proportion of people who are willing to do the kind of backbreaking migrant labor work of the previous generations is just lower. That's a fact. But I think also there is a growing awareness that even if you work really hard, you might not get the same economic returns that your parents or an older generation got. I think this might resonate with American readers and listeners, but there's one of the reasons why I wanted to profile the scooter thief is kind of the vein of uneasiness that he tapped was he felt like big companies were gathering all of the profits from his efforts. And so that's why he didn't want to work, and that's why he stole scooters instead. So in general, it's not a lack of willingness to work, but a disconnect between seeing what you're putting into your work and what you're getting out of it. But I've also, I wrote a story, this isn't in the book, but I wrote a story a couple of, maybe 2 years ago about this new generation of entrepreneurs. A lot of Chinese GDP is still generated from family-owned small and medium-sized enterprises, not SOEs, not Alibaba, but SMEs. And these were founded by usually families, a couple, and their children are now taking the helm. And there's been a whole generation of late 20, early 30-something millennials who are now running these heavy machinery companies, manufacturing companies, textile companies, and they have new ideas about how to manage human resources. It's more flexible, more humane in their eyes, doing advertising that's more international, thinking about products that maybe are a little unorthodox in their parents' eyes. So these are people who are working incredibly hard, who have been educated internationally and in China, but are engaging in economic activity that I think is still the heart of the Chinese economy. They're not doing consumer tech or fintech or anything like this. It's like pretty standard, straightforward manufacturing and industrial production. So there's that too. Again, China's not a monolith.
Great question. In the front.
Hello. I'm Jace Gilmore. I'm a director at the consultancy Brunswick Group in the geopolitical practice. Longtime fan. I guess my question is more specific, not so much on the particularities of China, but kind of on the conception of identity and the tension with identity you outline in the book. And something I'm curious about is, in your reporting outside of China, specifically your recent reporting either in Ukraine or in Syria, are there any insights that you drew or kind of universal truths or kind of strains that you saw in terms of similar tensions with identity or reconciling with kind of your identity between yourself and the state or your situation that you saw while in China that you kind of also saw mirrored outside of it in any shape or fashion?
Just to restate for those who couldn't hear in the back, the question is about reporting outside of China in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere, and if there were any kind of universal truths or connectivity in the questions around identity and the questions around identity and state that you saw in your reporting elsewhere.
Really good question. I mean, it reinforced my conviction that identity is political and politics is often about identity. Ukraine is obviously an example of that. They think they're Ukrainian. The Russians think they're part of a Russian empire, fighting a war for the last decade and a half over that. In Syria, it's called the Syrian Arab Republic, but it's not all Arab. So now the motto is Syria for all Syrians, but who is a Syrian? Does it include the Kurds? Does it include the Alawites? Is it just Sunni? Or do you make room for the Shias? What about the Druze? So I think every country is concerned about identity. They obviously want to forge some kind of common touchstone, while also ideally making room for other identities. But every country has a different formulation for doing it. I think the stakes are really high for a place like Syria, and certainly for Ukraine. I think they feel high to Xi Jinping in China. And in the beginning of the book, I talk about this speech he gives in 2012 about his diagnosis for why the Soviet Union collapsed, which is it collapsed along sectarian identity lines, ideological factionalism, kind of conceptual ideas of what should the Soviet Union stand for and who is part of that and whose vision for development goes forward. And he sees himself as the person who's going to put forward a much stronger unified identity for China to avoid what happened to the Soviet Union. I think that China's diversity is a strength. I don't think it comes at the cost of a unified Chinese political identity. And I don't think that China should be as alarmed as, say, Syria is currently about what is Syria.
We might have time for a few more questions if there's anyone else in the audience who wants to ask. Two more hands, so in the back and then up here in front.
Thank you. Hi, Adam Brooks. I wonder about the kind of flip side of that question. How far did you find yourself encountering, party-led, establishment-led efforts of assimilation, homogenization, the suppression of diversity and individual identities, and where do you think the trajectory lies in China? As much as we would like to think that we see the place as not monolithic. Clearly, there are people in China who want to make it monolithic, it seems to me. I mean, where do you see the trajectory going there?
In the time that I was in China, the party came to dominate a lot of these discussions and policies about identity. The party in general has just become much more visible in all strata of life. And I think that the China that the party would like to see is Han ethnic centric, or at least Han behaving, Mandarin dominant. I think that gender has been increasingly defined in terms of family rearing and reproduction once again, whereas that wasn't the case decades ago. I think it's become, the emphasis on party loyalty has become much more pronounced. And I think that China is trying to put forward in their mind, uniquely Chinese approach to everything from human rights to a reinvigoration of the discussion of Asian values to what a Chinese cyberspace would look like, that's where I think it's going. But I also think that, sometimes policies work better than imagined in China. Oftentimes policies are implemented in a much more scatterbrained and diverse, shall we say, heterogeneous manner than the central leaders would expect. So I also do think that there is going to be a cyclical opening period again, I hope, after this. But during, at least for the next couple of years, and this was my experience in China, I think that there is a closing down on what is acceptably Chinese. And you see this in business with party officials having more say over internal policy and education, even at the elementary level with ideological classes becoming they were always there, but no one really ever cared about them. And now they're actually more important. Two, of course, the more headline grabbing things like ethnic policy and national security laws being amped up and penalties being increased for corporations that somehow violate China's corporate interests and leak secrets and things like that.
And can I follow up real quick?
Mhm.
And this trajectory, I mean, have you ever felt that it's linked in some way or mirrors or is analogous to, say, the growth of ethnocentrism and nationalism in other countries around the world? That it's not necessarily a Chinese thing, but it's part of a larger movement that we can see manifest in Russia or Hungary or even here.
Yes, there are
how does that play
parallels.
out for you?
There are parallels, and I write in the book, it's understandable and not exclusive to China to want to create a unified identity, a strong nation state. And China is not alone in thinking of itself as an ethno-nation state either. The reasons I think behind China being concerned with this are slightly different, and they're the path dependency that China has taken to maybe arrive at the same conclusion as a leader like Viktor Orban has, or even Donald Trump, is different. But there are striking parallels between different world leaders, and this is not a question that only China is thinking about.
Final question, we have Emily Matson up here in the front.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, Emily Matson. I'm a historian of 20th century China. And so my question relates to identity as well. So to kind of follow up with the past couple of questions. When I teach history courses on modern China, I mean, one of the central questions I tell my students is very simple, but also very complex, is what is China and what does it mean to be Chinese? And from listening, I heard your talk at Feng, which was also great. And then this one today, one of the themes in your book seems to deal a lot with this question. So in your interviews with the various subjects in your book, what were some of the tensions there that you found in, you know, what that your subjects feel like it means for them to be Chinese?
People want to feel, what's the opposite of disenfranchised? Enfranchised as full citizens of the PRC, that if they're contributing to the project of developing China, then they're also considered full Chinese citizens. And so many of the people that I interviewed don't start out as dissidents. They consider themselves Chinese and are eager to contribute to the development of China, to find their place in Chinese society. But with a sudden change of policy or education curriculum or what have you, find themselves on the outside and are unwilling to compromise, to change themselves, to continue being in the system. One of the stories I tell is about a Uyghur family born in Xinjiang. Interesting family history. His grandfather was an independence fighter, so they carry that political baggage with them growing up. But although he becomes a Turkish citizen when he's a teenager, he decides to come back to Xinjiang and becomes, quite honestly, a mega millionaire by riding the wave of economic development in the 80s and 90s. And at that point, if you asked him, he would have felt extremely franchised, at least in his mind, in the project of Greater China. He and his brother, his business partner, changed their mind later on. And then eventually they have to live in exile. He loses his children temporarily to this detention campaign. His wife is still in prison. And he starts thinking differently about, well, what rights did I really have, even when I was a very productive member of the Chinese economy in this? So I think part of it's feeling like they're considered fully Chinese if they're going to learn Mandarin and to be productive members of society. I think one of the central tensions is because China is still an ethno-nation state at its core. And some of my chapters are about Hong Kong, and there's a brief discussion about citizenship law in Hong Kong under the Basic Law. That was a very, very contested issue in the 1997 handover negotiations, because Hong Kong has a distinctly not ethnic definition of being a citizen of Hong Kong. And so how do you reconcile those two legal regimes? That's not a highlight of the chapter, but I think this gets to like citizenship questions. And sorry, I'm thinking out loud here, but so when China thinks of itself as an ethnically centered country, again, that is going to come into conflict with all of these territories they've inherited or invaded and conquered to basically complete the Qing Empire, the boundaries of the Qing Empire under now what's the PRC. Those are just fundamental contradictions they can't resolve. So either you give up an idea of defining PRC citizenship as being Chinese looking and Chinese speaking and born to Chinese parents. You know, China has naturalized how many? I think it's less than 1,000 foreigners and given them PRC citizenship over the last 75 years, which I don't think they're willing to do. Or, you know, you keep that definition, but then you have really, really awkward cases for anyone who doesn't fit that description.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. Really interesting note to end on, and I think a really expansive question around identity in China that you're tackling here. But I think I know it continues to drive your reporting and the kind of the stories that attract you to China. So I think we can continue to watch watch this space for more from Emily on these really thorny questions around belonging, identity, and citizenship in China. And we, on behalf of the USCET team and everyone in the audience, we were delighted to have you here. So please join me in thanking Emily for her great talk. A few more notes before we go. We can't let you all leave without announcing the winner of the lucky draw. So please join me in thanking or in congratulating Megan Churchill on her win. Megan, stand up. Yeah. Congratulations. We're really happy you could make it, and please stay after and we'll give you the information about how to pick up the voucher. And thank you for joining us today. And thank you to all for coming to this first event in the China Connection series. We're excited to kick this off here and welcome you to future events. We gave a little preview of our May event coming up, and we'll have more information soon via email. We also have another event coming up on April 24th here at GW. It will be the local discussion for Chinatown Hall, the National Committee's annual event with China experts talking in a national webcast. Our local discussion will have Sean Stein, president of the U.S.-China Business Council, talking about U.S.-China economic futures, and I'm sure we'll have some good developments in that space between now and then, tariffs and everything else. So we hope you'll join us for that on the 24th. We also are going to stay here in this room for a little bit longer, and Emily will be, she has copies of her book for sale, and we'll be doing a signing here as well. So feel free to stay, chat, ask questions to Emily and get a copy of the book, or stay and meet the other participants and audience members in the room. We have a great group assembled, and I think I can tell there's going to be a lot of really good connections to be made among the folks who are in attendance. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope you'll stick around a little afterwards.